Hi everyone, and thank you for coming to the final air quality session of the day. I think we all deserve a pat on the back, I think, for making it this far and being so attentive to the amazing talks so far. My presentation today is going to be reflecting on some of the work that's happening in the UK, and I think it's good that we've got such a broad global understanding of some of the different challenges related to air quality, but sort of how these problems and potential solutions apply in a different global setting, it would be great to talk about later as well as we think some of these things through. So really it's going to be about two things, both looking at the actions that are happening within homes to meet some of the ambitious climate targets that we have within the UK, but also how that can at the same time sort of align with some of the sort of language we use around co-benefits to make sure both that those actions are good for planet but also human health, but with an equity lens. I think my sort of first hat has been described a bit. I mean, sometimes I describe myself as a geographer, sometimes an environmental social scientist. I don't know which one it is today, but we'll probably find out towards the end. Just sort of worth mentioning, I come from an entrepreneurial background. I run a company that also makes indoor air sensors. And if you haven't yet come across the Clean Air Programme, I represent that as a regional clean air champion. This was a £42.5 million investment by UKRI to develop new clean air solutions across the UK. So if you'd like to learn more about that and some of the sort of projects that have been funded, please come and talk to me. I think this has already come up a lot. I like these complicated figures really just to show the sort of real interconnections we're seeing, some of the different aspects between the home. Houses are a really important social determinant of health, and a lot of what I'll be talking about today is really within this red circle here. So indoor air quality, ventilation, damp and mould, but you can see it's related to a range of upstream determinants of health and ultimately a range of different health outcomes. Probably also worth mentioning, we're talking about here a UK setting. Really, we are an indoor generation. We spend around 90% of our time indoors. With climate change, this figure may increase, but in this presentation today, I'm focusing on that where we spend the most of our time, which is within residences, around 69% of our time. We've heard of some of the range of different, more acute indoor air pollution episodes that can occur, whether that is related to wildfires or the use of solid fuels for burning things like in cook stoves. It is worth mentioning that in higher economic developed countries like the UK, there are still other significant sources of indoor air pollution, notwithstanding the outdoor air pollution coming in from outside. Actually most outdoor air pollution we do breathe in the built environment. It can be many things from the building fabric itself to cooking and cleaning activities, moisture generated through taking a shower and simple things like that. So we still do have a range of different synergistic sources which can all contribute to good and bad indoor air. So what's the situation? Well, the UK, as part of its net zero targets, is trying to, across the whole system, reduce carbon emissions. And housing in the UK is a significant source of carbon emissions. It's around 20%. So it's quite critical that if we are going to meet these legally binding obligations around net zero, that we do reduce the carbon emissions that are coming from the built environment, around 20%, as I said. For the fellow Europeans in the room who've spent time in UK buildings, you'll notice that, a lot of them are very old, a lot of them are very drafty, and we sort of have quite a social acceptance of quite damp and cold indoor environments. So, a lot of that comes from, people laughing. We've got a lot of heritage buildings that we get a lot of we have a strong cultural attachment to, and some of the retrofit challenges that we're going to have in that space are going to be difficult. So a huge campaign of energy retrofitting is underway. The Climate Change Committee, and I'll forget the numbers here exactly, but it's something like 8 million homes require draft proofing, 15 million require upgrades to insulation. And when we think about this from a health perspective, it's particularly important because what I hope to convince you all of here today is that if some of these actions happen in response to climate, to meet our net zero ambitions, occur without ventilation being provided, there will be both significant health impacts and health inequalities. I think it's the sixth carbon budget balance pathway suggests that without adequate ventilation being placed alongside these energy retrofits, something like 200,000 life years will be lost by 2050. So it's a really significant challenge. I think sort of when we put that equity hat on, I think we, from a sort of basic viewpoint, we can think, well, actually, some of these actions to make homes more energy efficient, to improve insulation, are going to have some really significant positive implications. You know, sort of questions of energy poverty and energy justice in the UK are really quite significant. The huge numbers of people that have to choose between heating or eating, or the particularly vulnerable communities that are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of, for example, living in a cold home, whether it's our younger or older people or those living with a pre-existing condition. So potential benefit, right, of some of this energy retrofit that is already ongoing. But really the big concern that comes sort of for me is, well, what does happen if we're doing this without that purpose-provided ventilation being something's happening at the same time? And this is a sort of fairly simple model to illustrate what happens if you decrease the air changes per hour on the horizontal. It's a measure of ventilation. And on the vertical, a relative concentration of indoor air pollution coming from indoor sources. This is, of course, agnostic to what is coming in from outside, but it's probably not that conceptually difficult to grasp, right? You reduce ventilation. If there is a significant indoor source, it is essentially going to become trapped. And you can see why that would be important for things like moisture control and damp. So really, you know, what the sort of approach I like when we think about buildings is and homes is we do want that approach where we're building them airtight, reduces carbon emissions, improves things like energy poverty and fuel poverty, but that ventilate right aspect is critically important. Here's just one example to sort of make that point really clearly based on the case of radon in the UK. This is a radioactive gas that seeps out from the ground, primarily in areas where there's a high concentration of limestone and granite. This is actually the second leading cause of lung cancer in the UK, so it's a really significant impact on health. I think what's good as well is this is actually one of the indoor air pollutants where there are fairly simple technical fixes. This figure on the right-hand side just shows on the horizontal axis time in years, going from year 0 now to 110 years into the future. And on the vertical axis shows the change in life years relative to baseline, how many thousands of life years might be gained or lost based on energy retrofit with some different ventilation scenarios. I just want to draw your eyes to two different groups. Scenario 1 is the modelled impact of what might happen for radon and life years lost based on buildings being built to an airtight standard without any purpose-provided ventilation coming, about 4,000 life years lost. These other three, scenario 1 to 3, are with different means of ventilation being added. And you can see actually it's only scenario 3, which I believe is mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, where we're actually seeing, just for the case of radon, an improvement in health. So it's clear that when we're designing and delivering some of these different energy retrofits, we need to think carefully about not just ensuring ventilation is installed, but we're installing the right types of ventilation. Another thing that I think is important what I'd love is an interactive poll here, but when we think of retrofit, right, what's the first sort of things that come to mind? You know, we're thinking of the building. Yeah, please, yes. Okay, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's quite right. Yes, Tom.
Insulating your loft.
Well, exactly, insulating your loft, which probably is also expensive. Nice connection there. Insulating your loft, changing some of the mechanical systems within the space. But actually, there are a range of different technologies which can align some of those health and environmental co-benefits, which really should fit under this broader conception of retrofit. So it can be everything, and in practice it's going to be multiple of these at the same time. Everything from these building fabric and system upgrades, what we typically view when we think retrofit, to consumer products like air cleaners or purifiers, dehumidifiers, or replacement technologies like moving from gas stoves to induction. And that's one specific example that I'd like to make here. So transitioning to electric cooking in the UK could be quite a significant way for us to both align the health benefits for planet, but also for people. In the UK, this is a really significant source of poor indoor air quality. It's essentially an unregulated flame, large source of some of the sort of things like PM 2.5 that we're concerned about, but actually because it's complete combustion, probably that PM 0.1 and below, ultrafine particles, which are hypothesized to be worse for health because they can essentially get further into the body through translocating into the bloodstream. Gas also, which is used for gas stoves, it's a fossil fuel, right? So that could be another area within homes where we are championing that transition to something which is better for planet, but also more efficient. It might be lower cost for the participant to use. Half of homes in the UK still using this. So for me, I see this as a real piece of low-hanging fruit for this opportunity to align health and environmental co-benefits. And there are some significant health equity impacts of doing this because we know that actually for many people, what I breathe of air pollution, whether it's the same as someone who is asthmatic, the same concentration for me isn't going to have as much harm as it would for someone who is asthmatic. So if we can make those sort of improvements, it's going to be very beneficial. I just wanted to highlight this recent piece of work by Global Action Plan and CLASP that have done some of the different policy pathways analysis which could sort of help us with that transition to electric cooking. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of them, but please do have a look at this because they've got some really interesting ideas for actually what is required, everything from aligning with the future home standards to sort of give that economic incentive for building manufacturers to actually not install it, to making sure we can drive down the wholesale price of electricity. What I wanted to finish with is just a couple pieces relating to the sort of justice and equity parts, which I think will come out quite nicely in later presentations as well. It's come out in multiple presentations already today that, we're often thinking about the number of statistical value of the number of life years lost or premature deaths, but this is really affecting people. Each one of those numbers is a person, and I think just as we'll have seen the picture earlier of Ella Adu Kissi Deborah, a young girl who died, had air pollution on her death certificate in the UK based on asthmatic attack she had related to air pollution episodes. The case of Awar Bishak, a 2-year-old child who died prematurely from exposure to mould in his social housing association home, is really the canary in the coal mine, or the clearest illustration of something that I think we can all agree is manifestly an unfair situation and a call that wider action needs to happen within the built environment. I'll come back to that in a minute just to sort of relate that to some of the work around environmental justice, but just to illustrate again some of these situations of injustice and potential complications with a ventilation-based approach on its own. This is work from Lauren Ferguson out of, she was at UCL, now at Harvard, looking at the exposure of PM 2.5 indoors from outdoor sources, aggregated by different levels of social deprivation. The higher the number, the higher the relative social deprivation. It's a pretty almost linear relationship there between social deprivation and exposure to PM 2.5 from outdoors within the home. So any actions we're taking to improve indoor air ultimately also need to be part of a wider package of improving outdoor air because it's clearly influencing what we breathe indoors. So just to wrap up, and sort of some of this I think has been manifest in the presentations earlier, that there's been a long history globally of environmental justice being a really helpful frame to think through the disproportionate impacts of air quality. This has primarily been related to outdoor air, but a lot of what I've been trying to do in my work is bring this lens indoors. And if we think through the case of Awar Bishak, many of us, when we typically think of what is fair or just, end up just using one dimension of fairness, what we call distributive justice. Environmental sociology has talked about this for a long time. It's the who gets what of air pollution, who is exposed more or less, who emits more or less. I think that's sort of implicit in a lot of the claims we make around fairness related to environmental exposures. But a lot of what I'm trying to do in my work and with colleagues is have a much wider view, a multi-dimensional view of actually what fairness or justice means. So if we think about the case of Awar Bishak, distributively, it was clearly unfair that he was exposed disproportionately to concentrations of mould that were unacceptable. Procedural justice, which is very much related to how decisions are made and who has access to information. Well, if we start digging into why was he disproportionately exposed, we know it's because the social housing providers hid behind legal processes of disrepair as an excuse to not act. If you think about recognition, you can't talk about a normative concept like justice without thinking about the fact that we know from the US, for example, that black communities are disproportionately exposed. It's not an accident. That's a historical legacy of environmental racism over centuries, everything from slavery to policy making. We can't look at this disproportionate exposure of a 2-year-old black child from Sudan who is an asylum seeker and not make sort of that an important reason why their testimony might have been ignored. 2 more, capabilities. The family were told to paint over the mould issue, and there are even jokes with some of the contractors that they were breathing too much within the space. They can't breathe any less. They couldn't move house. It was social housing. So when we think about something like a right to clean air, that's all very well and good, but we need to think about capabilities of different groups to actually achieve that. And finally, probably the most trickiest to deal with, something we sort of call epistemic justice. This very much relates to whose knowledge counts when making claims of of experiencing environmental harm. Someone with a PhD presenting quantitative evidence that they've meticulously measured in multiple areas to give a number value of how bad the air is. When they go to the social housing provider, they might be listened to. But if it's someone who's relying on anecdote or observing the health of their child deteriorating over a long period of time without that recognised quantitative data, or perhaps they're using low-cost sensors rather than something that's recognised by regulatory authorities, you can say there's sort of a potential claim of somebody essentially being dismissed because they're not seen as credible. Very heavy, sorry. A few points to finish on, which I sort of hope can come out in the discussion later. I think when we think about retrofit, it's not just a energy and climate thing, when you think about it as a health thing. So we really need to make sure we're decarbonising in a way that makes healthy homes. We need to think a lot about the unintended consequences here. I don't think they can even actually be called unintended anymore. I think we know what the potential problem would be. Aligning health and environmental co-benefits is more than just about building fabric and system upgrades. There are a range of other devices which can be used. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the environmental justice movement. Just wanted to mention there's a lot of ongoing work in this space. For example, a new funded network looking at health equity and housing, HESTA, which I'm leading, as well as several large cohort studies looking at the health impacts of retrofit. For example, one here with the Born in Bradford cohort study looking at social housing. So thank you for listening.